Okay, we should kick off. We got the final two presentations from Richard and Hero. We're going to kick off with Richard, who's going to be thinking about the actual notion of an ecosystem, an entrepreneurial ecosystem, from a metaphorical perspective. So over to you, Richard.
Okay, well, hopefully you'll see some connections between what I'm talking about over the next 15 minutes or so and some of the earlier presentations, particularly the first Martin 1's presentation and Alan's presentation. Really what I want to do is unpack some of the ideas that are embodied in the notion of ecosystem and highlight some of the implications for the work we do in entrepreneurial ecosystems that follow from that. The starting point really is that metaphor is fairly universal in terms of how we think, conceptualize, and work. And that really is my starting point. If you look, however, at most of the entrepreneurial ecosystems literature, not at all of it, but certainly a significant proportion of it, it's kind of odd. It's focused on objectification, the discussion of really a phenomenon-based account of place-specific entities, either sui generis without or in comparative terms. There's a focus and has been a major focus on dimensionalization, really trying to answer the question, what is included or excluded in typologies of elements? And we've seen a lot of work done on that. And there has been some interest in demarcation, questions of what differentiates the ecosystem construct from other constructs, such as innovation systems, clusters, and so on. I mean, is this just a neologism for work that's already been carried out and discussed in different terms? And there has been a series of criticisms over the last 5-7 years that much of the literature is static, atheoretical, it's typological in orientation, it's scale agnostic. We still discuss the appropriate spatial scales at which ecosystems might be manifest. It's actor indeterminate. Is it entrepreneur-centered? Is it policy-focused? Indeed, is it sectoral rather than spatially oriented? And all of these factors seem to run through a lot of the literature. Positioning the entrepreneurial ecosystem idea itself, I think, is important to recognize that this is really a part of a wider trend in entrepreneurship thinking to the use of biological analogies, which we can in part trace back to Aldrich's 1990 book, which takes a natural systems ecological perspective on organizations. And the lexicon of academic and policy and practice debate about entrepreneurship really is suffused with biological analogies and metaphors. So we get used to discussions of mice as in small enterprises, elephants as in large-scale corporations, gazelles in terms of high-growth businesses. We've become somewhat obsessed by the idea of unicorns, and the entertainment industry has really given us metaphors of dragons and sharks. All of these are powerful conveyors of meaning, but they convey mixed messages. So that some of the associations, for example, of sharks and dragons are that they prompt ideas of fear and danger. Unicorns and dragons are fictitious creatures. And it's kind of interesting that entrepreneurship has got so hung up on these. And gazelles, of course, get eaten by apex predators. All of these are negative connotations, none of them necessarily connotations that are initially thought of in the use of these terms. But more broadly, I think we can see the biological perspective being manifest in microfoundation studies, for example, of the implications of genetics, physiology, neuroscience, etc. There are meso-level studies of metaphors that underlie, for example, discussion of business growth, which go back to Penrose's theory of the firm. And we see metaphors of organisms, natural selection, coevolution, and so on. And then we've the macro level studies of, for example, ecosystems, where there is an increasing interest in deriving general principles. Martin already, or Alan rather, referred to the rainforest analogy of the Wang and Horowitz book. We've seen Roundy's work looking at complex adaptive systems, Kuckert's work extending the ecosystem metaphor to look at how natural ecosystems are managed and how they develop as a template for how entrepreneurial systems might develop. What I want to suggest is that the ecosystem metaphor does carry with it some limitations and cautions. It is vague in many cases. There are blurred boundaries, and there are, I think, interesting implications to be gained from thinking through more specifically, more directly, the nature of metaphor. So, given the current state of the literature, what's the status of entrepreneurial ecosystem as a construct? In some respects, it still shares the characteristics of what Andrew Sayre, a number of years ago, described as a chaotic conception. And he draws a distinction, Sayre draws a distinction between rational abstractions, which isolate a significant element of the world, which is some unity and autonomous force, which is coherent and integrated. A chaotic conception arbitrarily divides the indivisible, or lumps together the unrelated and the inessential, carving up the object of study with little or no regard to its structure and form. Now, for Sayre, chaotic conceptions may be used unproblematically for descriptive purposes, but as he goes on to say, when they're deployed with any explanatory weight, there may be problems in terms of assuming similar properties or behaviors where these may not exist. Material differences may be obscured. Assumptions are made as to what defines or distinguishes the object. And I think if you look at a lot of the entrepreneurial ecosystems literature today, it kind of falls under that categorization. The term itself, however, is imbued with meaning that changes with the interests and purposes of those using the concept. And much of the debate in the entrepreneurial ecosystems literature really has not addressed the issue of who is drawing up these definitions, who and what is included, and what's excluded. There is ideological work going on here in terms of, as we've discussed earlier this morning, stroke this evening, the ontology and epistemology of entrepreneurial ecosystems. And I think there's much work to be done to unpack this. In these terms, I think we can see entrepreneurial ecosystems as a complex category in the sense that Marx discussed it in Gundry's. It's not subject to simple definitions, however much we would like that to be the case. It refers to a composition of so-called simpler concepts and ideas. The nested hierarchy idea is central to the idea of ecosystems, as we'll see in a moment. These simpler concepts and ideas refer to yet other ideas. And really, to unpack and fully understand the entrepreneurial ecosystem literature, I think we need to go back and develop, understand, and apply the relationships among the simple categories that comprise the complex category. And in that respect, Martin's discussion this morning, and to some extent Alan's discussion as well, begins to tease out how that might be done. And I think that's important in moving from Sayre's chaotic or descriptive conception to a proper understanding of what really is a complex analytical category. And I think we need to re-engage systematically with the ecosystem metaphor as we use it. So what is metaphor? How do we unpack it, and what are the implications? In terms of definition, metaphor is really, I mean, to go back to Mary McCluskey's work in 1964, it's a linguistic phenomenon where a word usually applied to one sort of thing is applied to another sort of thing. In other words, we simply think and talk about one thing as if it were the same as another. That raises some issues which I'll unpack in a moment. In terms of framework for understanding the nature of metaphor, the key text, key framework, I think, was established in the classic book by Lakoff and Johnson, The Metaphors We Live By, variously described subsequently as cognitive metaphor theory or the cognitive linguistic view of metaphor, to alternative framings of essentially the same perspective. The key elements of this are that metaphor is not primarily a linguistic phenomenon, but a cognitive phenomenon. It's how we think. We understand the world through metaphors. The focus of understanding is in some intangible entity. So social and political institutions, the entrepreneurial process, broadly defined, would be the target, the focus of our explanation. The metaphors we use become crucially important, and I think this is a vital point. The way we experience the intangibles, such as the entrepreneurial process in a culture, we are defining in terms of the ecosystem as the core metaphor. What the ecosystem is, how it applies, how we work with it, as Alan's presentation has already made clear, is important. And all of this, I think, is important to note, grows out of our experiences. The reason metaphor is important is that science, and science I use in the terms of any body of organized knowledge, not the narrow view of natural science. Traditionally, the view of science is a process of direct observation of phenomena, where the language used to report findings is neutral and objective. But we have to recognize that phenomena are not always accessible. They can be observed in more than one way. Sometimes they have to be because we're coming up with approximations to identify the process. Scientific knowledge is constructed socially and through linguistic processes. Anybody who's experienced the peer review process of a journal article can understand the point at which, through several cycles of review, one can end up with a feeling that one's written a paper that is the paper the reviewers and the editor wanted to see, rather than the paper they wanted to work with. So the idea of neutral and objective knowledge is somewhat compromised by the process that we work through. And we are dealing with phenomena that are poorly or partially understood, and which are complex and often not directly accessible. And I think the measurement issues that we've talked about this morning in terms of entrepreneurial processes, the dynamics of that, the processes themselves, the outcomes, the correlates, I think demonstrate that we are working in an area where there is partial understanding. And it's in those areas that metaphor becomes particularly powerful. In Semino's terms, explaining the role of the cognitive model of metaphor, metaphor enables us to think and talk about complex, abstract, inaccessible, poorly delineated areas of experience in terms of simpler, more concrete, more accessible, and better delineated areas. They, as she puts it, frame the phenomenon in particular ways, foregrounding some aspects and backgrounding others. And this idea of foregrounding and backgrounding, the framing process and who engages in that framing is an important element of how metaphor works, which perhaps we haven't discussed in the entrepreneurship context quite as much as we might. But I think the key point here is that we are looking at discussing and developing an understanding about complex processes and areas of experience in terms of simpler processes. That leads to a fundamental element of this perspective of metaphor, which is the relationship between the so-called source domain and the target domain. The source is the more physical or tangible, and the target is the more abstract kind of domain. For us, the nature of the entrepreneurial process in the most general sense is the target. The source domain is the concept of ecosystem. And the basis for making that choice of matching that source to that particular domain really has grown out of our experience of how we deal with or attempt to measure the process of entrepreneurship. One of the things points that I think is important to note is that this is not a one-to-one mapping in most cases. There are basic and essential conceptual correspondences between the source and target domain. If they didn't overlap, if the meaning systems didn't overlap, there'd be no basis for developing that metaphorical understanding. But if the source domain and the target domain overlap exactly or coterminous, then there's no scope for generating new meaning beyond the basic correspondences. And there is an important discussion, I think, around blending as a process, where the joining of a source domain with a target domain might result in conceptual materials that are genuinely new with respect to both the source and the target domain. And I think the work that Martin and Alan have reported on already this morning, I think begins to show some elements of how that might develop, that in applying the metaphor, we have the scope to change not just our understanding of entrepreneurship, but our understanding of the ecosystem itself. In applying this framework, I think it's important to understand that there are different roles and perspectives on metaphor and theory making. To go back to a classic paper by Richard Boyd, there's a distinction between what he calls exegetical or pedagogic metaphors. Those are metaphors which illuminate and clarify our exposition, but they are metaphors that are dispensable. They could be omitted without affecting the argumentation as such. So you could say, to give a very simple example, you could take the sentence, Julian is a lion, as a metaphorical sentence. There's no loss of meaning in rephrasing the sentence, Julian is brave, because the notion of brave is subsumed within the notion of lion. So the metaphor is essentially a dispensable linguistic convenience. More interesting from our point of view are theory-constituted metaphors, which really are about, in Boyd's terms, the development and articulation of theories in relatively mature sciences. And there is an issue of how pedagogical and theory-constituted metaphors interrelate, how one leads to and develops into the other in emerging scientific or scientific domains. They are, in that context, necessary conceptual schemes. They frame the interpretation we build of a world that is unknown. And they are discursive practices, to pick up on a comment made in the discussion of the last paper. They are essentially discursive practices. They're part of a storytelling process. And they provide the linguistic machinery of a scientific theory, which has no other language for the subject of interest. In other words, there is no other way of framing our discussion, in this case of the entrepreneurial process, or there is no better way than to use this metaphor. The question then arises, how effective, how fit for purpose is the metaphor? And this is an area where I think, again, if you look at a lot of the extant literature in the field, we're not questioning that, we're simply assuming that the metaphor works. It's taken on question. There's no systematic consideration of its appropriateness, its fitness for purposes.
We've only got a couple of minutes left now, Alan, just to let you know.
Yeah, no problem. Thanks, Rob. So what I want to suggest is that ecosystem, the source domain for our discussions, is itself a complex multidimensional concept. It's not, in Simeon's terms, it's not a simple concept. And when we talk about, if you go back to Arthur Townsley's definition of an ecosystem as a biotic community or assemblage and its associated physical environment in a specific place, you can read that immediately into the entrepreneurial ecosystem discussion. But I think it's important to recognize that ecosystem itself as a concept can be understood in three dimensions. There is the meaning dimension, that is the biotic and abiotic features and interactions between them, the complexes, the nested hierarchical structure that implies, the fact that these ecosystems are scale independent, but do have explicit spatial extent, and that needs to be specified and is bounded. And we don't make narrow assumptions about what an ecosystem is. But the ecosystem also functions as a model. There is a requirement as a model that ecosystems encompass a biotic complex, an abiotic physical complex, and the interaction between them within a specific space. And if you look at the ecosystems literature, and building on some of the comments Alan was making, you can see that there are a number of examples of these models in terms of energy models, nutrient models, biodiversity models, economic flow models in the ecological economics literature. And in the entrepreneurship literature, we've only begun to touch on developing and applying some of these models and frameworks. And then finally, there is the sense that ecosystem itself is a metaphor. It's discussed as a machine, as an organism, as an algorithm, as a resilient structure or a fragile structure, as a place, as natural capital, as life support. There's discussion of ecological footprint. What we're doing, in other words, in entrepreneurship with the entrepreneurial ecosystem concept is taking a concept, the ecosystem, in terms of meaning, model, and metaphor, which is itself incredibly complex, and applying it in the entrepreneurship domain. It's not a one-to-one translation. The source concept is more complex, but also potentially richer in the scope for application. So to wrap up, I think we need to pay more attention moving forward to the whole issue of foregrounding and backgrounding in the application of metaphor. What is emphasized and de-emphasized in the variations of the ecological metaphor that we're drawing on? What's the nature of the framing and meaning-making purpose? What are the different narratives and discourses that are generated from different perspectives on what ecosystem is? Are we working with pedagogical, descriptive, but limited metaphors, or are they theory generative? And what's the process of moving from one to the other? And finally, what do we make of the source and target? Do we recognize that they are not coterminous? Do we really have an answer at the moment for the question of who chooses which parts of the source to illuminate and which parts of the target? There is scope for much more debate, I think, around those issues. And finally, I think there's a recognition, to quote Hans Wanger's work on the philosophy as if, which is takes us back to a sort of neo-Kantian idealist epistemology. We're working all the time with indispensable fictions. All of our work is symbolic or analogical, and metaphors are part of that indispensable fiction. It's how we work, it's what we work with. So I'll leave it at that point, and happy to take any questions.
Thank you very much, Richard. That's very thoughtful. Any questions? Can we take some questions? We're a little bit behind in time, but we got a couple of minutes, I think, Fumi tells me. Your presentation reminds me, Richard, of the paper 2003, I think, by Ron Martin and Peter Sullivan around clusters, which people often cite as sort of trying to bash Michael Porter in a way in terms of fuzziness around clusters. But it seems to me that over time that clusters, you know, the notion of clusters has become quite enduring in a way. I think, you know, within scholarly fields, I think within policy and in business as well. Because I think, you know, and I think, to be fair to Ron and to Peter, I think they've done a lot of work later in terms of addressing issues around framing and mean making.
Yeah, that's an interesting comment, Rob. I mean, one of the issues around the cluster debate, and particularly the Porter perspective on clusters, was the point at which Michael Porter announced in one of his papers that his latest analysis demonstrated that something like 93.7% of all economic activity in the United States was in the form of clusters. And part of the Martin and Sunley critique of the clusters literature was, if everything is a cluster, then in a sense, nothing is a cluster. And I think there's a similar caution to be observed with the entrepreneurial ecosystems concept, that if we see everything as an ecosystem and universalize the metaphor, there is a danger that we lose any sense of meaning. What I'd like to see is we go back and unpack the nature of the ecosystem part of the entrepreneurial ecosystem.
Hello, very interesting discussion. I wondered what your thoughts were on this in terms of these kind of different trends, different concepts that we see coming and going. Do you think it's a bit more of a kind of, you know, Carlota Perez style waves of technological development where we have new concept come in and then that wave peaks and then it necessarily declines and then we all wait around for someone to come up with the next concept and we all jump on that bandwagon and we keep going on this kind of these waves of trendy concepts? Or do you think there's a situation where these concepts can all be kind of added to each other and sit alongside each other? So when entrepreneurial ecosystems comes along, we don't necessarily need to replace innovation systems and clusters and all these things, but they can kind of coexist happily. And if they are going to coexist happily, how is that going to work in the kind of neoliberal publishing environment where we're all under pressure to kind of have a bunch of citations and to kind of create these, we're kind of pushed into creating buzzwords, I feel, in a way. And if we're going to say, well, we're going to stop this kind of wave cycle, we're going to let these concepts coexist and keep working on older concepts. How do you think we can do that within this kind of pressured environment that we live in? Sorry if those are two big questions to ask you, but you seem to have a lot of wisdom on this, so I'm going to throw them at you.
Appearances can be deceptive, Rhiannon. Two very big questions, as you say. I mean, in answer to the first one, yes. I mean, there are cycles of concepts, and I mean, we live and think through metaphor, as my opening quote from Nietzsche suggested. And there are a succession of metaphors which point to different discourses, different ways of framing an issue, some of which may be complementary and can be held together, some of which may be replacements. The question I think we need to answer is the extent to which a new framing, the adoption of a new metaphor generates new insights, genuinely new insights, as opposed to the introduction of new terms for old concepts, where we're simply playing linguistic games. The link between that and the performative neoliberal research metric-oriented world we live in is a different challenge. I mean, citations essentially require you to be part of a conversation. And if, for example, the ecosystem conversation is replacing the clusters conversation, not because it's necessarily better in epistemological terms, but because it's better in sociological terms as a growing, more dynamic community, that might be where the citations will be built. And I think one has to take a pragmatic view of how that's going to develop and where you want to position yourself. And I would certainly position myself differently if I were to turn the clock back, as an early career scholar, I would probably play my publication game rather differently to the way I can afford to do it as an end of career scholar.
It's actually more of a comment than a question. Anecdotally, when I pushed my students to adopt a metaphor for their respective ecosystem that they were studying, some were studying the ICT, so they pushed the computer system as a metaphor. Some were studying medtech, so they pushed the anatomical metaphor to help visualize their system. Every one of those metaphors broke down faster than the ecological one. So they tried the biological one, galactical one, social systems, like a nightclub metaphor, anatomical systems, nervous systems, computer systems, but the ecological one had the longest legs and resonated the most with what we saw in the entrepreneurial world.
I think that's an interesting observation, and I think it does indicate. I mean, I think it came across in your presentation. It came through in Alan's presentation as well, to some extent, that there is a richness to the metaphor which needs to be unpacked. And I think there is more to the metaphor and more scope for application than we have yet touched on. And that's both positive, and there are also negative sides. I mean, there are things that the ecosystem metaphor is not going to fully explain. But I think we've only scratched the surface of what's out there in terms of the potential of the metaphor.
Thank you very much, Richard.